Biggs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have to oppose this proposed amendment, and I'll tell you why. I'm just going to give 3 quick reasons. Number 1, under Title VIII, someone who is not inspected and admitted into the United States is already subject to mandatory detention. Failure to detain those individuals is not consistent with the law. It may be consistent with practice, but it's not consistent with the law. The reality is, when an individual is released instead of held mandatorily, we have found that we lose complete track of them. We don't know where they are. So it makes almost a charge like this becomes almost a nullity. The third thing is due process. In most cases, if you are charged with committing a murder or an aggravated assault, you will be brought before a court to determine your release status. Failure to have adequate ties to a community would be one reason why you'd be remained. Flight risk would be another reason you'd be remanded and held. And I think that this bill, as it is consistent with current due process and the reality of the situation, and also Title VIII, and so I oppose the amendment. Yield back.
Could the gentleman yield for just a moment?
So I'll yield to you, Mr. Chairman.
I just want to, again, emphasize the point that you made. An illegal alien is already subject to mandatory detention under existing law. That law was ignored in the case of Sarah Root's killer. It's being ignored in the case of more than 6 million illegal aliens that this administration has deliberately released into this country and about whom we know very, very little. And the fine point of the matter comes down to this. If this law had been enforced, or if this bill had become law, Sarah Root would be alive today. And that's the bottom line. And I thank the gentleman for yielding, and the gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes Mr. Nadler for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Chairman, this bill makes subject to mandatory detention anybody arrested or charged with, never mind convicted, of various crimes. That is opposed to the basic concept of due process. Now, some of the Republicans say, well, illegal aliens are already subject to mandatory detention, or ought to be. But we're not only talking about, but this bill is talking not only about illegal aliens. People who are here legally under DACA, for example, people who were brought here at 2 years old 30 years ago and are clearly Americans except in legal status, or TPS recipients. These people are here legally and yet would be subject to mandatory detention if arrested or charged with, never mind being convicted of or admitting to. That violates basic notions of due process. In addition to which, there's total hypocrisy. This bill will subject a lot more people to mandatory detention at a time when Republicans refuse to give the Department of Homeland Security the resources it needs to enforce the existing law. Congress has never appropriated, and no administration has ever requested sufficient resources to detain all non-citizens who fall under the mandatory detention categories. President Trump never tried to detain all migrants subject to mandatory detention. And this bill would expand who is subject to mandatory detention to people here legally who may never have committed the crime, who are simply arrested or charged with, and put them into facilities that we can't even fit all the people who should be in these facilities because Congress hasn't appropriated the money. The Trump administration hasn't requested sufficient money. The Biden administration requested, I think it was $16 billion to increase this and didn't get it. So this bill would simply do violence to all our notions of due process and do nothing to help solve the problem at the border. We have a problem at the border, but it wasn't deliberately created by President Biden. It existed under President Trump. It exists under President Biden. Conditions abroad have increased the number of people who seek to come here, conditions for which the United States has no responsibility: climate change, political violence, gang violence, instability. These are what drive people to try to leave their homes. Nobody wants to leave their home where they've grown up unless circumstances make it necessary for them to do so, usually. So this bill does violence to due process, subjects people who have not been convicted of any malfeasance of any sort to mandatory detention, and that does not increase anybody's safety. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? Seeing